Hey denizens of the internet, welcome to Endgame, hosted by Psych and Popopo. Today we're going to talk about Cyberpunk, our dystopian future, with our co-host, Greer Valder. Yay!
Yay!
Oh,
Welcome everyone.
awesome. Thanks so much,
Yeah.
Fail. Hello, everyone.
Yeah, and thanks for coming.
Welcome
We have
to our-
Gur.
Yeah.
Yes, we have Gur
This is
here.
Gur. He's been on our show before, on the episode that we talked about game development, so you might remember Gur from that. And so now we are back to talk about Cyberpunk in our slightly cyberpunk aesthetic up Endgame.
We always have the same.
I like it.
We mostly have the same place.
So Gur, why are you here? Tell us about why, what are you into Cyberpunk? What's the deal?
Well, thank you for asking me. Hi, everybody. Yes, to answer your question, I have been in love with Cyberpunk since one of the big reasons I got into game design and specifically into VR. Because the moment I saw the Oculus DK1 come out, I got a dev kit for it. Got a dev kit also for the DK2 and so on. Because to me, it was just like, okay, the future is here. Let's start diving headfirst into the cyberpunk age, which I am in full belief that we are beginning the origin story of our own cyberpunk age at the moment. So I'm both excited and incredibly terrified.
Yes.
I love
It's
that.
pretty dystopian, I think. I mean, we talked about, so you guys know the most about Cyberpunk. And I guess how many people here, thumbs up or thumbs down if you're very familiar with Cyberpunk? Because I would say I know barely anything about it, so I'm curious if most
I
people
think thumbs up. Okay. Some people don't know.
Yes.
Catapult doesn't know. Okay. All right.
Okay, so we got a good mix,
Neutral.
actually.
I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
I do
And
have one question.
Yeah.
Do you know the graphic novel Transmetropolitan?
Oh my god.
it
that's
is
so funny.
one of my...
Yes.
I just changed my my profile pic today to Spider Jerusalem because he is one of my icons.
Yeah,
God.
that's
I love it.
amazing. Yeah, we gotta
Yeah.
talk about that because you mentioned that, Gur, and I know. So, Gur, you know a lot about Cyberpunk and Popopo. You have had a blog on it as well, too.
Yeah, yeah.
And wrote
I've
about
been a
it.
fan of the genre like for a long time. I've had like fiction, so like it's basically why I'm into VR as well, and it's informed. Like when I used to write more fiction, cyberpunk was like a kind of a theme in my fiction writing, and then I had a blog for a short while that I don't know. It was like a project that I never finished, but it was going to be about how our modern world is like it is the cyberpunk future basically that was envisioned in the 80s, and like connecting old ideas to their modern equivalents and stuff. Because I think that cyberpunk has actually just gotten more and more popular over the years, and I think it's because it resonates with people because it's got a lot of facets of what we experience.
Well, that's a great way to start things out because for those of you here who don't know what cyberpunk is, it's essentially if you take the love child of Reagan era economics with the punk culture movement of the 60s and 70s, with the counterculture movement that was spawning from the Star Wars-esque sci-fi fantasy movies and novels, you end up with cyberpunk. Because during the time of cyberpunk when it first came about, it came about as a big counterculture movement to what people expected sci-fi to be. Because it was just coming off of this little film, I don't know if you know what it's called, Star Wars, which basically was the movie that not only proved that sci-fi was worth filming about, but that you could make a stupid ton of money off of, like Scrooge McDuckian levels of money from. And so because of that, every novel and their mother started writing novels made in the same vein as Star Wars.
You got fat.
Which was both good because it, brought about, a big upheaval in people liking sci-fi. But on the downturn, it made this very, what you can almost say, very 50s kind of feel to sci-fi, where it brought back an idea of a clean utopia of all these things of a future that is beautiful, pristine, of course has its own problems with fascism, which was a common theme for the time, which also harkens back to the 50s themes. Sorry, go ahead.
Star Trek has that utopian vibe too.
Right.
Yes. And then there's the dystopian element as well, which
Absolutely.
I'm curious about, because I think in the 80s you mentioned like Reagan era economics and things like that, and basically like, and you talked about the mega corporations forming and things like that and growing. So it's an element of utopia and dystopia as well. And I'm also curious, I think, I don't know if we remember, I forgot to mention the circle. If you guys have something to say, you can come to the circle, or you can use the exclamation point emoji, but you just have to keep using it until one of us sees you use it, and we can because I'm curious what people think about this. But yeah, so we kind of talked about what is cyberpunk and what is, I guess the inspiration for cyberpunk. We heard about, you had talked about a couple things like Blade Runner, Romancer, the punk movement, and things like that. We heard about what was the name of that other one that you mentioned?
Transmetropolitan was a big kind of defining moment about what makes not only cyberpunk, but what really makes up the good cyberpunk, what cyberpunk is really about.
And what's interesting about this genre is it spans like tons of media. So it's it was in anime with like Ghost in the Shell, and like that's one of the that's one of the kind of pieces of fuel for the cyberpunk movement. And then it was also in books. So Snow Crash was and other books by the author was a really popular cyberpunk novels, and Snow Crash in particular like spawned a bunch of terminology that we use. So to my knowledge, like Snow Crash was the first to really popularize the term avatar as a virtual image that you wear over yourself in VR.
What's the premise? Basic premise.
So the premise is a future where government has kind of gone by the wayside in favor of basically this feuding chaos of corporations that basically they all own the land, and they kind of like have their own independent governments over very small territories. And so basically so like the standard governmental model has broken down, and it's would you mind muting your mic when you're not speaking? Thanks. And it takes place in VR. I mean, there's more that happens. So like the story is about a virus that can infect people through VR, and so I mean, there's lots of stuff going on in there. It's also a samurai sword wielding pizza deliverer as the protagonist, and so there's a lot of fun stuff going on in there.
Anyway, so I'm sorry, go ahead.
It also popularized the term metaverse as the social layer of VR.
And Freeman, did you have something? Are you in line to say? You can come to the center if you're something to say, or I'm not sure.
Hello, good day. Yes, just in the movies and stuff, it's always like some sort of huge conglomerate, like huge mega company who always seems to be the one who's always, the one who goes suppresses the people, makes everyone poor, everyone sad. I mean, do you see that happening soon? Because I mean, there are some huge mega companies, even today, like Google, like Facebook, Amazon. I mean,
so interesting.
Go ahead, Bert.
What I was going to say is, it really depends. That answer is dependent upon a few things. The biggest thing is that cyberpunk, the whole reason mega corporations even exist in cyberpunk was to be the logical extreme of Reagan era economics, because during that time of Reagan's presidency, he started doing massive tax cuts on corporations during the time, and started lifting a lot of the regulations. So, yeah, exactly. So the whole idea behind it is the logical extreme of deregulation, capitalism, as well as, you know, just letting corporations run free and only follow profit with little to hold them back.
This was in the 80s. So
yes.
Who was what corporation? You mentioned a corporation or something that they
yes,
weren't as big as Apple or Google or Facebook, which is what Freeman you're kind of talking about. But IBM was another one I think you had mentioned.
During the time, IBM was massive, and it definitely spurred a lot of the ideas behind what these computer companies are capable of. Of course, during the time was also Microsoft and Apple, but really no one stood up
Microsoft
to IBM.
Got broken up, right? I mean, there was some kind of legislative. It seemed like with Microsoft, I don't know this is how related this is, but Microsoft had legislative action taken against it.
Right. The whole idea behind that was, that was actually one of the last big attempts to do trust busting with that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because they tried to create a monopoly based off that, and it was pretty quickly. Well, not quickly. It took a lot of effort from a lot of different bipartisan things going on, but they were able to break it up finally. And we really haven't seen that since, because it's pretty.
It was an interesting, like, speculative time, I think, for fiction in general, because, like, there were a bunch of things that were, like, I mean, technology has been accelerating for a long time, but it, you know, like, it really, you know, continued to pick up the pace, and the internet was just getting started, and the entire, like, the focus on corporations as sort of the governing bodies, like, it's only a minor, exaggeration, I think, of where we were experiencing then, and also what we're experiencing now. There's dialogue online about how these places online are like places that we are, you know, residents of, you know, in a lot of ways.
And what does it mean to be a resident of a person? You know, like if it's and that's another. There's like this thing about the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Manual for Psychology, that like if you use it to diagnose corporations actually as people, the amount of narcissism and antisocial personality disorder that would be present would be like astronomical.
Right. So
well, they said they were people. They didn't say they were well-adjusted people.
It's all
true.
contextual, right? But
yeah.
But to answer your question, I don't think like a single corporation coming into like having the power over everything makes much sense. Just because for every like one corporation that exists and is huge, there are hundreds and thousands of corporations that basically support its operation and like provide a bunch of the background stuff that you never get to see.
Exactly.
I mean,
like
just one more to lead on to that, a quick one. You know, now, you know, the Chinese companies are the ones who are, you know, popping up all over the place, and you know, they grow big because, you know, they're the ones who these days can pretty much copy all the technologies that, you know, around the world that they have, and they can do it much cheaper because, you know, they manufacture it where they have. I mean, where do you think we will go from that? Because obviously the Chinese, eventually they'll get tired of manufacturing their own stuff. So many people say they'll move, you know, they'll outsource to India or you know, Africa. After that, you know, I mean, where do you think the world will go in terms of technology?
It's also becoming like, that's a really interesting question, because I think it's also becoming, you know, ubiquitous. Like everyone is doing that basically. All countries are kind of doing that to each other. So it's like, I mean, in China is more blatant about it. They take IP from companies in the U.S. or whatever, or other countries, and then, you know, use it in their own country. But I think that's the thing with Cyberpunk, with dystopia, is that it was a vision. I think the most interesting thing that I learned from you guys about it is that, or this idea that it was a vision realized in the 80s as technology developed. And it's kind of like that arc for any technology, like VR went through this, where you discover a technology, realize something is possible, and then it kind of fades into the background a little bit until it reemerges as a trend, which I think 1984 is an interesting example of that as well. But yeah, so I think that
to answer your question about to answer your question about the Chinese companies, though, there's a bit of a there was a step missing there, and it's the fact that they're probably not going to get tired. It's not the country or the companies that are going to get tired. It's going to eventually be the people that get tired, because, and the only reason that they have the manufacturing that they do is due to what I would akin to crime, human-related crimes, including people being treated as less than human, horrible working conditions, and so on and so forth, and not the ability to unionize or anything like that. So it's due to that they're able to have the manufacturing boom that they do. And it's only if their people start getting fed up that you're ever going to see China starting to outsource it to other places that still allow that kind of thing.
And one last thing is that about this, I think, is that they have the social credit
crimes
system.
against humanity.
Okay. They have the social credit system as well, which I think is
Right.
an example
Yeah,
of cyberpunk. Is that one cyberpunk reality instead of the one that we're going to
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
But that's like a heavily dystopian one, right? Where the government is basically control of everything, and it's like highly oppressive under that one particular regime. So so I guess the cyberpunk mythos or whatever is playing out very differently in different parts of the world. And one of the themes of cyberpunk is, in fact, like one of the main themes is the high tech, low life disparity, where you've got extremely sophisticated technology for those who can afford it, and then but it's kind of counteracted by people living in poverty and so there's entirely different styles of living for different people depending on where they are. And so that's a theme throughout the cyberpunk genre as well.
You almost see that here in VRChat,
I have a question.
Full body tracking.
I have a question. Do you think Tokyo, Japan is the closest thing we have to a cyberpunk society?
Because so I actually have a good answer.
When we went into another world.
Because let me finish.
Yeah.
Let me finish. Because Japan has so much technology, but if you can see the people in it, many of them live in small apartments. Many of them actually still have low lives, and of course they still have the fact that they have high suicide rates. That means Japan can be a very sad country sometimes due to the fact that they're also, even if with all the technology they have, they're still one of the saddest countries in the world.
So interesting pieces about this. The biggest thing about this, when it comes to considering Japan, which is a staple within modern cyberpunk, is actually quite a quote from William Gibson back in 1984 even, where he basically flat out said, modern Japan is cyberpunk, which both comes with the positives and negatives that come with that, because you're correct. They are still one of the most technologically advanced nations on Earth, and that is still true today, if they're not the most. But the important thing to grab from that is, and to reference your high-tech low life, is that it's not so much the technology that matters. What matters is how the technology affects us as people. Because right now, as you can see, there's a very sharp rise in otaku culture within Japan. And for those of you who don't know, otaku culture is very much think of that guy after high school who basically still lives in his mom's basement or lives alone and contributes almost nothing to society and basically consumes media all day, every day, and just eats enough to subsist, eats enough to live, and basically just lives in whatever they're consuming.
There's also a rise in the hikikomori.
Term for that.
Yeah, hikikomori is actually a type of otaku.
The guys just stay in the room. Like their room is their.
That's hikikomori.
Okay.
Well, it depends. Hikikomori is a subtype of otaku.
Yeah.
Well, otaku specifically has to do with
like a fan.
With your relationship with the fandom. And
right.
hikikomori also kind of fits into the cyberpunk theme of disappearing into the net and like just living entirely in VR, or living entirely like isolated
like towards
socially
the Matrix,
and everything.
Towards the Matrix, it's getting towards that.
Yeah.
But oh yeah.
Dexter, I had a quick comment.
And then
I
Pika,
believe.
I know you've been waiting a while too. So we'll get to you.
I had something to add on to Lyco. The reason why it's so sad in Japan is let's face it, it's crowded. They're running out of resources. Eventually they're going to have to outsource to other countries like America, where they have to ship people there to live. High suicide rates are because there's not enough jobs to support everyone.
I don't know if it is that simple. I know that overpopulation in cities is a huge problem.
Actually,
overworking.
But
Japan
there's
is
always
so
going to
much
be a lot
bigger
of
than the provinces. It's just the problem is that most of the population is concentrated in one city.
Well, isn't that true of most nations, though?
Shrinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, the population is shrinking. That's kind of the problem.
Well, I think this idea of like having people inside their house, like the concentration in the city, and then having people inside of these apartments and like living in a virtual world, I think it's interesting because it relates to climate change. To me, it's like I've talked about this before on the show and stuff. Is like that I think climate change is getting. And Gur and I both live in the same city, and we work together. So we are, and also Atari does too. But basically, we were hearing sirens going off, and I was just like, what's going on outside? And it was like raining, and we got flash flood alerts on our phones that were buzzing, with the alert system. And I was thinking, like, as the sirens were going off, I went into VR. And I was thinking, I'm literally coming out of this environment where probably a lot of people are feeling anxious, hearing the sirens. I'm literally transporting myself out of that weather and into this world. And I think that's going to happen more and more. But also will reduce, well, actually, no, it might use more resources because for the internet, not like the Alexa topic that we had. So,
yeah.
But,
sorry, Pika?
Yeah. Can we go Pika?
No, I wanna hear your comment towards that, because I'm gonna introduce a different topic.
About what?
Okay, thanks.
Were you gonna say something about that, Gur? Transporting yourself to out of the climate?
Well, when it comes to something like that, it is also relevant within a lot of cyberpunk. Usually it's Japanese cyberpunk, though, that represents some kind of dystopian event that kickstarts the cyberpunk revolution. Or I guess one could say the fall into cyberpunk. And I think it's quite obvious to see why Japan of all places would have to have a dystopian event occur first, because usually it's either a chemical, biological, or nuclear thing that happens. They definitely have a history of understanding the effects of what happens during those events. Which is
it's a good lead into the topic I want to introduce. There's a book I've read. It's Amusing Ourselves to Death. It's basically with the technology that's introduced, we basically distract ourselves with entertainment until we just kind of that's our life, our entertainment. So has any cyberpunk ever really touched on the idea, because no one really predicted with user-generated content is going to become mainstream. And now, because in a lot of the cyberpunk that I've read, a lot of these big corporations, they control the media, and it's a big propaganda machine. But now... now you have the internet and you have social media, and now anybody can have a voice. So any crazy or wacky can have a voice. Now we have the so when you go home at the end of the day and you want to entertain yourself, you have the choice of not only traditional material like books and crafts and stuff, but then you have television, then you have radio, whoever still listens to radios, podcasts, internet, YouTube, video games, VR, just an amalgamation of just anything. And so it's almost to the point where, because I remember back in the 90s when a new episode of a particular show would air, everybody at school would be talking about it, because we all, there was the only thing to watch. But now it's just like, what do you watch on YouTube? Oh, I watch this and this and this channel. Oh, I've never heard of them. Well, what do you do when I go? Oh, I play video games. I don't even know about YouTube. What's YouTube? And it's just like has any, that's creating a lot of echo chambers.
That's a really good point.
What's kind of interesting about cyberpunk, or at least the genre, I think, is that we were talking about its predictive power, and I think in general that's true. But I don't know. Most of the media, the cyberpunk media I've seen, do not paint a picture of that future where user-generated content is on a level with, professionally produced content. And I think that's kind of encouraging.
But that's a relatively new thing within the past 5 years.
Right. So yeah, it is very new, but I don't think it's going away. I would be very surprised if it did, because everybody's getting more resources to be able to put their own stuff out there. So.
And I think it's interesting.
It has ever
came to mind when you're talking about this.
Well, it has because now we're getting into the realm of deep fakes and everything like that. Has Cyberpunk ever touched on that?
Well, yeah, you have
funny
the
enough
media
when
that's basically able to do that. But I just want to make a point about Reddit real fast. That Reddit has that social ranking that you're talking about. It became a social network that you thought everything was actually being displayed and ranked, and it's this kind of what you're talking about. But then in reality, there are complex ways that the same organizations or institutions that you're talking about, thinking that this technology is allowing people to escape from, are actually sometimes able to manipulate the vote on Reddit or whatever, and those kinds of things. So it's kind of coming full circle.
That's why I like VRChat. Advertisers hasn't interfered with it yet.
Yes,
it's
pure. The funny thing is when it comes, when it comes down to things like deep fakes or things like that, that's just a logical progression of an argument I've been hearing for a very long time. It actually, the first time I ever heard it was back in Photoshop's early days, where everybody was like, "Oh, Photoshop," where you can Photoshop, the president doing literally anything and sell it as a real picture and things like that. So it's definitely not a new thing.
But that's been happening. Oh, yeah. That's been happening since World War II and in propaganda days.
Was it Stalin?
Oh yeah.
The thing about human psychology is that it's very hard. The thing about human psychology, even though it's fake, it's very hard to have a distrust for your sensory input.
Yes, you have an automatic association with the sensory. Yeah.
To kind of continue on this topic, Gur, I wanted to ask you if, how in general, can think of some examples where how is media, the topic of media, handled in different cyberpunk media that you've seen? Is it do they talk about it? Is it TV? I know some of it is VR. How is the topic of pop culture handled in cyberpunk pop culture media?
So that's an interesting question, and the best case that I think I've seen it has been in two places. The first one is in Blade Runner. Blade Runner has pretty much been the piece that has completely defined the visual aesthetic of cyberpunk, where you had the big neon everywhere, you have advertisements everywhere, which is, by the way, supposed to be a bad thing. But nowadays I find that if you don't have all these neon advertisements everywhere, it doesn't look cyberpunk enough. Which is just a complete remodeling of how you're supposed to think about all that. But that's interesting.
Screw LED,
but,
bring neon back.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, I agree with that. I really like LED and neon. But the idea behind pop culture being handled in cyberpunk comes from a few different places. The first being Blade Runner, where advertisements are pretty much on the sides of buildings and everything. And the second is in Transmetropolitan. In Transmetropolitan, you have the protagonist Spider Jerusalem sitting in front of his TV, as well as consuming all sorts of stuff here and there. And eventually, it comes to a point where he's watching TV, and I think the TV says prepare for something like intracranial compression blast or something like that, and where he gets blasted with compressed advertisements that unravel during his dreams,
I remember
which
that.
is
that was funny.
So great.
Okay,
it was fantastic.
As much as an annoyance it would be, I would actually really love for my artificial intelligence food processing machine to manufacture drugs for itself.
That is certainly true. That's a part during the story. Is that the drug that his house is high? His apartment is high. That's part of the show.
The artificial intelligence, it figures out that, oh hey, instead of making food for humans, I could just manufacture drugs for my own program. So that's what it does. It's an addict to its own process.
Yeah. Which, funny enough, that all. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm about to change the subject a little bit.
Oh, so was I actually.
Oh. Go ahead.
I was going to talk about the punkist part of cyberpunk because that leads into it pretty well. So the idea is that we have the first part down. We have the cyber. We know what the cyber looks like. But what we don't fully get down a lot of the times is the punk aspect. We usually take along the visual aesthetic. We usually take along, all the common tropes and things like that with cyberpunk. But we don't really consider what makes it punk. And for those of you who don't know, maybe, the punk movement was a product of the 60s and 70s. Where it was very much a time. Exactly. It was very, very down with the system, down with authority, very anarchist, very loud, very in your face, and very drug fueled as well. And that is the part that kind of feeds into the cyberpunk part of things, because when you have a protagonist in a cyberpunk story, they're naturally going to be very distrustful of authority based off of that. They're also going to be somebody who's usually they tend to be tormented by some kind of addiction or some kind of tendency that's dangerous or things like that. Hold on just a moment. I'm also taking a look at something really quick. Oh yeah, there we go. I'm sorry, I was also reading my notes on that one. And it also comes very heavily from film noir. Which is just the idea of somebody hard-boiled, which just really comes more in line with kind of feeding into the punk aesthetic of like distrusting literally anything around you.
Interesting.
Yeah. What are your thoughts about the punk part of cyberpunk?
Well, I actually, when you were talking about that, I don't know how closely related it is, but I was thinking about comparing it to the internet as it is now. I think, well, it's kind of interesting because I think in the older days, the internet was a little, it was more anarchistic, right? It was more, it was kind of a freer landscape, I think, in some ways, and more, it's obviously gotten more and more commercialized, and I kind of find that interesting. I was, and I was thinking about the people who started the GNU public license stuff. Like they are, invested in free software. Basically, like their ideas about software is that basically it's something that you should know how it works and you should understand how it works, and it shouldn't be obscure and it shouldn't be behind all these walls to be able to know how it works. And I feel like that, I don't know, when I first encountered that, like it reminded me of kind of a sort of punk, the punk side of cyberpunk, because like it's basically trying to democratize our technology, but then those voices have been kind of they've been definitely pushed to the side under the swell of commercialization that the internet has seen. So
that's a very big issue, actually. What are the biggest issues behind that? I'm sorry, what is that, PD?
I've got, well, you asked what are our theories on punk. I've got a theory that actually brings up our evolution with the punk movement. Because if you think about like how humans evolved, where we are the hunter-gatherer tribe, and like our brain can only capacitize like 150 people as like close people. The average limit of what the human brain could actually like compartmentalize. The going through puberty, where some people are biologically programmed to like reject their elders or their older, the people that know above them, as a healthy way to break away from the main group. And that's why when in modern society, when you don't, like, no one's really fighting to survive, the younger generation latch on to a technology movement to almost like to fuel that like biological need to like break away from the what their parents understand. Like that's what. So like every generation has its technology that they latch onto and they stick with the rest of their life. Like my parents, they grew up in the era of television. Television was a new thing when they were teenagers, and they really latched on to television. They still watch just the primetime television channels. They don't really have cable.
Yeah.
I mean, they do have cable just for sports, but that's it. Like they just watch Fox and.
Yeah, I think part of that is that you're actually evolving along with the.
Yeah.
I like the evolution content because you're evolving along with technology, and
so why is everyone's music taste hardwired to when they say music was the best, music is from this era is the best. Well, if you go back, it's like the era that the music that they listened to when they were like 14, 15, 13.
Right. So that's the thing.
It was like around that time.
With adolescence, and the brain doesn't fully develop until you're 21. So I think we're seeing this actually with younger ages too, like a 3 or 4 year old.
But what happens between?
iPad. Hold on. Just
okay.
1 sec, Pika. Adolescent is engaging with technology, or a 3-year-old, as they're evolving with the technology, it's impacting their brain and actually leaving a lasting impression, and they're actually engaging with it in a way that's permanently changing them. So that's really interesting what you're saying with like adults or people with different generations. They become kind of interacting with the technology. And one example might be parents, and a lot of adults or older people don't necessarily understand why people use Facebook and why they're so into Facebook. But people whose brains were not fully developed, who started using Facebook, part of the notification system that's like the social validation became ingrained in them as a way to perceive validation. And so we have a much different attachment. We're evolving with these technologies, and the idea of receiving notification that indicate someone else cares. We're evolving with that technology. And so, yeah, I think it's a really interesting point of cyberpunk that there's generations.
Does it ever make you?
But why do humans go through a phase where we reject the adult figures?
That's true. Hold on. Before we.
I mean, it's beneficial to a society if a group does that. Like, we obviously don't want.
People always rebel. Even in the 80s, 90s, 70s, they're always like that.
Yeah,
if nobody rebels, society stagnates.
It's part of evolution.
Like that.
Yeah.
So, the biggest things about rebellion and fun things like that is its era in cyberpunk and things like that is the whole idea of the punk revolution behind that whole thing was very much in the era of a lot of government distrust, because not just from Reagan, mind you, but also the punk movement really hit its stride during Nixon. And if you all remember, Nixon pretty much put a giant splotch on the trust that the American government really had. And it's due to that the punk movement really hit its stride, and that's when rebellion really hit its height, because it basically became a game of, okay, well, if we can't trust anyone, then fuck it. Let's just go crazy.
You know what that makes me think of is like nowadays in the current situation in the real world right now, when it comes to cybersecurity and hacking and all those different things, like the most sophisticated hackers and the biggest cybersecurity threats are governments. Like they are the ones that have the resources to know how to hack things and to make the most sophisticated viruses, and they basically like they are the biggest cybersecurity threat, like, period.
Yeah.
And interesting.
Absolutely.
And you talked earlier about technology outpacing ethics as a theme of cyberpunk, which is like projecting the future. I think that's interesting.
The core theme of cyberpunk, when you break it all down, is it's essentially how advanced technology kind of shapes this new gray area we have with, privacy, identity, ethics, what's right and what's wrong, and how can you tell? Because when it comes to governments and things like that, I would dare say that they are incredibly dangerous. Like, no doubt about it, they are threat number one. But what we really have to be scared about are private groups. Like, we're talking maybe teams of maybe 4 or 5 people that are just happen to be like massively talented programmers and hackers, being able to get in and do whatever it is they want to do. If you just had, I don't know, maybe like 4 or 5 people in China who want to screw over, let's say 2 million plus American people, they can do that fairly easily. In fact, it happens all the time.
And with cybersecurity, there's so few barriers to entry when it comes to that security. I was thinking though, doesn't technology always outpace ethics? Like, I know that our technology is accelerating slowly, but I was thinking of it's accelerating quicker now, and it was slower before. But like even during the Industrial Revolution, when people were able to invent factories, they just went ahead and did it and employed as many people as they could for like pennies a day or whatever, you know, barely enough to survive on, as they're doing grueling labor for 12 hours a day or whatever. Like that, you know, that's not ethical. That's an inhumane way to treat laborers, but because the technology was there, they just did it, and then later it, you know, society was adapted and we could have labor unions and everything, but until that until the technology occurred, we hadn't developed those things.
Then does that mean that cyberpunk allows us to, or leads us to think that reality is inevitable? Like when we read these fictional accounts, we're like, oh my god, this, like China's, for example, was like that too. So I'm just I mean, it's kind of crazy, but I'm sorry, I didn't see you Freeman there either. But
well, one final note on this, on that specific thing, is that you're absolutely right. It is a roadmap, but it's a roadmap that's paved with logical extremes, and that's an important factor to keep in mind. Is that this is very much logical extremes. So as long as we don't hit those extremes, we're fine. And what we're starting to see now is Cyberpunk came about as an answer to the question of what happens when you have completely deregulated capitalism and completely deregulated everything. Like what happens when, you know, government basically falls to the feet of corporations. When you take that much power away from the government, what happens is the power begins to pool in smaller pieces, those being the mega corporations. Essentially, it goes from one big government to your local warlords being, you know, the ones in charge and things like that.
We're seeing political movements now where people promise not to accept any donations from corporations, which I think is kind of resistance to that reality. So it's interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, what I wanted to say was like, I mean, that's the scary thing. You know, these mega corporations taking over in terms of like VR. You know, for, you know, what we love here. Why are we here? VR. I mean, that's the thing, really. I mean, in my opinion, you know, it's just, you know, do we really want, you know, a VR to suddenly get so popular that, you know, you get loads of Chinese knockoffs and stuff? I mean, I think...
Man,
there's nothing
say,
at
like,
its
right
core
now...
wrong with Chinese knockoffs.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's bad.
I'm kind of, like, where we are with VR right now, I feel like it's kind of a... I don't know, I'm worried about it because we've seen what happened with the internet. You know, it had this indie phase, it had its
stuff.
Right, and then slowly became more and more commercialized and more, and now it's just this bloated like commercial place that's like can be pretty gross in a lot of ways because that's ads is how anybody stays in business, and it's just ugh.
But there's an interesting piece of information that you brought up there, and it's that it is bloated, but the problem isn't that it's bloated, it's that it appears bloated. It appears to be corporate, and that's because the corporate part hooked its teeth in. But in reality, the internet hasn't changed, just the way we use it. If we wanted indie parts of the internet to survive, we can make it survive.
We could pay.
Heck, that's the whole
social network, for example.
Oh well, don't even think about that. Think about the dark web of all things. Heck, that's kind of like still the core of what the indie internet is all about, because Google doesn't list them, but Google is corporate internet. Google will always, like at the moment, Google is corporate internet. If you cannot find it on Google, it may as well not.
Right.
Exactly.
Links, for example.
So they're
indexing. Did you have a quick? I saw the index. Or sorry, the index finger.
Come on, Catapult.
Yeah, just a quick thing. The thing about big corporations and all that, they need tax write-offs, and advertising is a tax write-off.
Oh,
that is true.
Right. Yeah.
So that way, there, a company like Apple that makes almost $1 trillion. They can afford to spend a few $1 billion on advertising because it's a tax write-off. So that's why you see you turn on the TV, you see these Apple 10, iPhone 10 commercials left, right, and center.
Yeah, it's mega. Interesting.
Yeah, that's a
a
big
mega
thing.
person, I guess. Is what we should really call them in the US.
What was that, Poplipo?
There was something I was wanting to talk about a little bit, which is you know how, and this is about kind of more speculative than kind of about the real world, but like in the cyberpunk genre, whenever VR is depicted, almost universally, you know, it's not depicted as separate from the internet. It's seen as as a natural visualization of the internet as it already exists. And I find that kind of interesting. I find it interesting that our current implementation of VR differs so much from that, because right now I am extremely a little less extremely, but in a VR program, I'm very cut off from the rest of the internet. I can't, you know, right now in VRChat, I can't go to different websites. I can't look up things on YouTube. I can't ping the outside world at all, and I feel very isolated. And it just seems like such a dramatic departure from how the metaverse was envisioned. Is there? Do you think that there's a way to merge? Is there ever going to be a way to merge the two, or are they separate forever?
I have Google Drive up in my window right now.
Yeah,
that's true. The interesting thing about
personal...
that. Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about that is, it's not the question of if it will happen. What I'm going to say to you is treasure it as it is now, because it's not going to be like this for a very long time.
100%.
Yeah. Everybody who's here, treasure what you have right now, because right now this is like early days of new grounds. Like, we are just having the time of our life right now.
Yeah, we said that 3 years ago in VRChat too. With the old VRChat where you could literally hop into any active world.
Well,
the new
I like how non-commercial it is right now. Like that's definitely what I treasure, is that it's just right now it's just a creative playground.
Yeah,
exactly. But I would like
treasure
to get
it
to
as
the rest
it is
of the
now.
internet.
Capitalists. I saw do you have a quick explanation points?
Yeah, I'll just say this. Corporations have already reached into VRChat, mate.
Oh, sure.
Let's see. They sponsor. I'll just say this.
Go ahead.
I do a lot of events in VRChat. There's corporate sponsors for right now. They're already reaching into VRChat. Like, say, a talent show. I don't know if you guys have heard Project Gold. That actually has corporate sponsors. They're already in here.
Wow, that's new.
I'm sure they're already in here.
No, they weren't before. I mean, I guess 3 years ago they weren't. So this is interesting. Like, what corporations are in VRChat, or like what advertisements have you seen? I guess.
Well, suppose for specifically Project Gold, you're gonna have to talk to the main guys. But right now they're hosting like this grand tournament, and they're in talks with the mods and all that stuff. But
Hey,
let's say like avatar creators.
Do you have like something you can link to for this? Like, is there a blog or something?
For Project Gold?
Whatever this thing is. Wait, I don't know what it is.
You should post it in our Discord. If you go to endgamevr.com and then go into our Discord, you can post your advertisement and the advertisement that I just gave. It's like meta advertisement.
Because I'm curious. I'm curious what this is.
It's like that Burger King thing with Casey Neistat.
I mean, let's be honest. At the end of the day,
I love it. Yeah.
Sorry. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, it's all about, you know, who's willing to. How much is VRChat, the developers, willing to sell this for? Really, at the end of the day,
they have investors, right?
Yes.
I mean,
that is a question. VRChat has investors, correct?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yes,
they do.
So the answer to that question is whatever makes their investors happy. So what makes their investors happy is profit. So they will sell it for whatever they need to.
Yeah. And eventually, advertising. If there are shareholders, advertising will eventually creep into this game. Simple as that. It always happens, doesn't it?
Unless the revenue model is different. Like, I think
you log in and there'll be an advertisement.
Fortnite doesn't need external advertisers. I mean, although, you know, I think it's a really interesting model that we have these different. I mean, that's Cyberpunk right now for these teenagers who are literally spending hours in Fortnite.
I mean, Fortnite's a very.
You know,
I mean, Fortnite
it's no different from World of Warcraft in that case.
18 million players, and like, you know, it's a different world, I think.
We've got to talk to Lousy, and then we're just about done. I did want to mention though that, like, if you want another monetization model to be viable, then make sure to support it, because that's the only way it's going to happen.
Yes.
Is if you are the one who enables it.
That's a great point.
Ozzy.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to. Hey. I just wanted to talk actually to the particular point of monetization versus advertising and otherwise. And yeah, I agree. For people who mentioned Fortnite or most of the free-to-play games, video games now, monetize internally to whoever owns the game. So, and they do that by selling cosmetics. They do that by selling. I've actually just started playing Magic Duels, which is online Magic, and it's free to play, but they allow you to play versus any number of people. And if those people buy cards, their decks are better. So you're incentivized to buy cards to make your decks better, as an example. So there's all sorts of
that's related instead of cosmetic, which is interesting.
Right, but there's all sorts of ways that companies let's say VRChat does want to monetize, which I assume they do. They're investors. If they bring in outside advertising, then maybe they get a pittance from the advertisers and have to share it. But if they can find a way to monetize on their own, whether it's selling custom things you can use in VRChat or helping with avatars or whatever, I think it's preferable for most companies to be able to take whatever revenue they are generating and keep it all to themselves.
Right,
so that's why it may not necessarily be advertising. It may be some other thing that we haven't come up with yet that we aren't sure about.
You brought up something I actually want to share with everyone of what I think would be an amazing monetization model for VRChat.
Well, hopefully Ron is listening.
I know. Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah. Hey, if you're listening, hi. First off, hello.
Hi, Ron.
Second, one of the biggest things that I think is a complete wonderful opportunity. I think advertising could possibly happen. If they didn't want to go with the direct monetization route, they have really two ways of doing it. They can either go with, technically three. The first is donations, which is technically true. The second is advertising. The third is data collection. Yeah, the third is data collection. However, there is a hidden one there that I don't know if they've thought about yet. And it's the fact that, when they're coming out with things like Playmate, it's not called Playmaker, it's called Udon. When they start to release that, what I don't know if they've thought of yet is turning this into a bit more of a platform for games or for experiences.
Yeah.
Well, for anyone who hasn't tried it or heard of it, a guy named Lakuza recently made I think a 10-hour experience where you literally go to a Westworld-esque world, except it's Final Fantasy 13, and you fight 80-story bosses and ride chocobos and solve go through mazes, and there's this massive. It's in VRChat now, so that's another option they could go, is either to provide. Obviously, this is not something that they can charge for because it's assets from other places, but eventually they could provide experiences like that. And I think the thing that they have already is the social. They have the ability to have a number of people in a social environment together. So they've already got something like Orbis or any other MMO would have, where they have the social working, and if they can gamify that in some way and then monetize that gaming, then boom, they've got immediately they could have a big hit on their hands. So that's just one example.
What they could have is just worlds that cost money. I mean, it could be that simple. Is that it really could be treat it like Steam. Treat it literally like Steam, where basically you go to these. You got your hub world, and it goes.
If I put on a portal right now to $1 world that you have to pay $1 for,
right?
Then but then it becomes discriminatory too.
It costs like $20.
Well, no, it doesn't become discriminatory. It only becomes discriminatory in the way that Steam is discriminatory, which is not that much.
It changes because. If you monetize avatars versus monetizing worlds, it allows everyone to access the same content and have the same social experiences. But then you can modify how you have those experiences versus a thing where it's either you can go in or you can't kind of thing with worlds. So it's an interesting. And I think that's why what I love about VRChat is that I think the VRChat team has been very creative and careful about. I mean, they mentioned this in the first year of VRChat, like 3 or 4 years ago. Was that they could implement whatever an avatar store like that was something that they talked about in a town hall. But what are the implications and how could it change the communities? Like, they're really, really sensitive and care a lot about the community. So I think that it's good almost that they're waiting and trying to figure out what will work and everything like that. So Yeah, it's just interesting because all these things have implications, and this is cyberpunk for us. This is my cyberpunk.
Yeah.
My cyberpunk reality is that I finally got my parents to buy all the parts to a computer, and they're building a computer so that they can come into VR. And I'm like, fuck yes, finally I've won. I'm like, I'm
Hi,
like,
Mom.
it's happening.
Nice.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
exactly. So, and Eve,
And
you know,
I
she's
think
been on Endgame
I
and
think
stuff.
that's the case. Like, so much of this is like, this is how it's playing out. Like, all of this
Yeah.
stuff was envisioned, you know, back before when it was speculative and sci-fi, and now like we're getting to see, oh, this is the, you know, this is the real world incarnation of it, which I think is pretty exciting.
Yeah, we're the players.
But I just want to say just one last thing, not necessarily related to this, but look up Yakuza's world and check it out because it will blow your mind. Dude spent like he spent like 10 months on it, 10 or 11 months on it.
I think that's a good idea.
At the end of this, let's just put a portal down to it. At the end of this, we'll just put it down.
Okay.
Put down
Yeah, that sounds good. Okay, so we'll do that.
At the end now.
Yeah. We went off a bit of a tangent. However, I think it was a cool tangent.
Any final thoughts about Cyberpunk? Before
the biggest thing I want to recommend everyone is if you want to learn more about Cyberpunk, there are four, considering Poplapo on this because I agree. There are 4 pieces of media I would watch or read. The first is Blade Runner. Blade Runner kind of gets you into the visual aesthetic of what Cyberpunk is. Neuromancer. It brings about a lot of the core ideas and the way we treat technology in Cyberpunk. Snow Crash. Snow Crash is an excellent novel about VR itself and how VR, you know, has become, you can explain it better.
It's also about neurolinguistics and mythology. It also worked in there too, so if those things interest you, it's got that.
Yeah. The last one I recommend is Transmetropolitan. And the reason I recommend that one specifically is that it kind of integrates the punk back into cyberpunk. Because the first is like very Japanese, it's very cybery. The other two are very cybery with a lot of Asian aesthetic. And then Metropolitan comes in and goes, don't forget the punk, and just whams it right into your face. And it's awesome.
Nice.
Wow. Cool. Well, yeah. Well, I think we're
basically
at the end, so we can wrap up here and take a group picture. But then we can check out I guess the most advanced world, one of the most advanced worlds in VRChat with this whole.
It's definitely the most advanced world I've seen. Like as far as
I'm really looking forward to seeing it.
Yes.
Sounds super cool. Okay, all right. Security's off. Come up. Let's get a photo.
Come take a group picture, guys. And we are the cyberpunk community. We are one VRChat is the cyberpunk community.
Is that what we should say? We are cyberpunk?
Short ones.
We are cyberpunk? Okay.
I'm pretty short.
Stand here.
Oh god, not that one. It's that. It's so
Where's this music coming from?
Oh, okay, it's in my face.
Ooh.
Ooh, the cyberpunk music.
Yeah.
Yippee!
Okay, what do we think?
We are cyberpunk.
We are cyberpunk.
Well, I have a much better word for that then. Oh, that's easy. Fuck authority.
Whichever one.
I mean, it is punk.
Authority.
Well, sorry for that. Cyberpunk.
We are
cyberpunk.
Yay. Alright.
Yay.
Lau. You gotta put down that portal.
Oh, I actually haven't been there yet. I've just heard about it. Or I got
yeah,
so, yeah. Wait,
Where's
it's called,
Ghost?
I think it's called Luxurian World. I got to see a beta of it when he was still working on it. He took me through it and showed me like all this amazing stuff.
Oh, cool.
Is it Forgotten Valley? Okay. I thought it was Luxurian World, but something along those lines. Yeah.
Wow. And Sokol, we were looking at your world because you also have an awesome cyberpunk world too, which is
Wait, what? Oh my god, I just been playing loads of Skyrim, bro.
Wait, was it your world?
I've been playing Magic Duels a lot. I'm playing a little Skyrim, but I've been playing a lot of Magic.